And if anybody does want the video file, I can send that to you also. So thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Sophie. I am the regional manager for the Northwest region. And we do have quite a few Northwest people here today by the looks of things, which is great. But obviously, by virtue of this being an online webinar, it's open nationally. But I'll just say a quick few words about PRCA Northwest. So we are a vibrant community of agency members, got some great, lovely, big agency members, mostly based in Manchester, but also in Wigan, in Liverpool. And we've also got a number of in-house members as well as freelancers and individuals. So got a vibrant community. We've got a great new committee who are helping us to charge ahead and put some really interesting events in the diary. I have a number of events coming up scheduled online and also in the pipes for in person. So if you want to know anything about Northwest or just want to have a chat to me, then do drop me a note. You should have all received an email from me anyway with the details of today. So yes, we hold these webinars fairly frequently, and we make them all available on the PRCA YouTube afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our host, Nick, who I've known for a while now. He's, I'd say, a friend and collaborator. Very interesting tech journalist specializing in fintech. I'll let him give you more of an update about himself, but just in terms of the format for today, Nick's going to be talking for about 20 or 30 minutes. If you have questions during that time, if you could pop them in the chat, that would be great. And then afterwards, we will have a Q&A session and a chance to speak with Nick yourself. But if thoughts occur to you throughout, if you could just pop them in the chat, then that allows Nick to talk uninterrupted. And I will hand over to him because it's him that you guys want to hear from. So thank you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. And hello, everyone. It's great. It's an honor to be asked to do this. And I think I should just say at the start, because I might make some criticisms or suggestions about how PRs or could improve their media pitches, but I'm not one of these journalists that sort of looks down on PRs. I've always thought that it's a kind of symbiotic relationship between journalists and PRs, and like a lot of freelance journalists, totally separate, independent to my journalism. I do, quite a lot of work. Probably the majority of my time now is spent advising companies, on media content and the sort of content consultancy, thought leadership, particularly focused on the tech industry. And I've worked over my time with dozens of PR agencies, generally in the B2B section. And as Sophie suggested or outlined at the start, I'm just going to talk a bit about me as a journalist, then this notion about how to pitch journalists in the age of AI, what do national media journalists want in a story pitch, what will kind of cause eye rolls and what will cause journalists to lean in and open and read to the end of your media pitch and get back to you. I'll talk a bit about AI slop. If time, I'll also talk you through what I think is a kind of template for, if not the perfect pitch, then a pitch which is a kind of strong format and will increase the chances that the journalist will sort of get back to you about your pitch. And then at the end of the talk, I'm going to sort of give a sort of special free offer for just 2 PR agencies that will be picked at random from the kind of metaphorical hat. And I'll give a sort of free half-hour call with me to sort of pick my brain just about your one burning media or content problem for one of your clients. And we could sort of work that out over the next month or so. But just a bit about me. And my career in journalism. I've been doing this for a long time, over 25 years now, mainly in business journalism. I've written about almost all aspects of business and industry sectors, as well as the economy, society, politics. I started off, I kind of fell into business journalism really, and was almost, after doing a broadcast journalism diploma, was really struggling to get into TV journalism as sort of TV researcher for documentaries. And this was way back in the late 90s. And then I remember going for a PR job, and that didn't work out. It's perhaps just as well for me in the PR agency. I think one of my clients might have been Gucci. So there was me in my sort of next baggy suit, and going for a very sort of high profile luxury PR job. But then I sort of fell into journalism in the trade press in the late 90s, started off on working on some big trade magazines at the time, Accounting Age, Computer Weekly, also Community Care, about the sort of social care sector. And that was at the sort of the boom of the trade press, when large trade magazines were making millions of pounds in profit. And then I went into worked for a newswire, which merged with Thomson Financial, Thomson Financial, and then it merged with Reuters. Then I left there, worked for the Guardian newspaper for a bit on their business desk. And then, went freelance at the height of the financial crisis, 2008, so not great timing. And since then, I've worked for reported for the Financial Times, the BBC Radio, and as a producer for BBC Breakfast TV News. Also the Telegraph, lots of trade magazines. And at the same time, independently to my journalism, then I've worked for dozens, hundreds of tech-focused companies, PR agencies, advising them on media strategy and content, including, Edelman, Golin, Microsoft, Salesforce, HSBC, Goldman Sachs. So I like to think I've sort of almost seen it all in terms of media relations and long-form content. As I mentioned before, I mainly write about technology. Again, just fell into that. I live in Liverpool now, but I was a kind of economic migrant in London for about 14, 15 years, but been back in Liverpool now since about 2012, 2013. I think it's perhaps worth me giving my take on PR and journalism before we go into sort of talking about media pitches. I think PR and journalism have been getting tougher, particularly in the last sort of 5 years or so. Obviously, you'll all be aware that, of the newsroom job cuts. It seems every month there's a new wave of job cuts in newsrooms, or certainly every year. And feedback I get from PRs, particularly in B2B agencies, it's getting tougher. Clients are getting more demanding. I'd say a lot of clients are actually sort of borderline deluded. The PRs are trying to land media coverage in a shrinking media. And I kind of liken it to, I don't know if you've ever seen something on YouTube about, you've got this diver on a sort of a really high diving board, and they're looking down at this, swimming pool that looks about the size of a tea towel. And I kind of think that that's how sometimes PRs must feel when the clients with very little newsworthy stuff are trying to, and minor product upgrades are trying to demand that they get, front page of the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal. And so you're sort of trying to hit a a smaller target. And I think there's also a sort of perhaps a problem with some of the model of PR agencies in that I think there's often too much focus on outputs, on pumping lots of press releases, story pitches to journalists, just so you've got this, monthly report to show to clients. And obviously, I'm sure that's, present company excluded, but that's the kind of impression I get. My impression, I don't have any evidence for this, but as a sort of national journalist, and now I've got to mention before, I mainly write kind of a news analysis articles for the Financial Times, and since about 2018 I've written about over 50 mainly tech-focused articles for the Financial Times, and so I still get a lot of pitches from journalists, not from journalists, from PRs. And my instinct, my feeling is that the overall quality of story pitches I'm getting from PRs is worsening, and it's been getting worse certainly the last 10 years, and in particular the last 5 years. And I'm not sure why that is. I think it might be that there's so many distribution platforms for press releases and content, and so many of these platforms connecting journalists with PRs and press releases and journalists who want expert comment, that it's just getting increasingly easy to spray and pray and bombard journalists with pretty flaky ideas and story pitches and generic press releases. And I think it might also be PR agencies are under more pressure to do more and deliver more with less. And I think there's the AI factor as well, that it's now really easy to sort of churn out a huge amount of press releases, story pitches, just using AI. And I think I'll go into this in a bit more detail, but I think that's generally a bad idea. And journalists, I think me included, can sort of see when a press release or a story pitch has been written using AI or largely using AI, and I kind of recoil from that. And certainly, if I see that, then it's going to go straight into the spam folder. And I think there's also this stuff that PRs and companies are just jumping on fads when it comes to content or pitching ideas to journalists, like all this recent stuff about the rise of storytellers. And I think there was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about this, and how storytellers are now some of the most in-demand people in business. And I think that's just BS, really, because when was the last great story you read that was promoted or published by a large company, a large business, or a large B2B PR agency? I think the actual number of great stories that are told by companies, by PR agencies, whether in long form content or in their case studies or their story pitches, it is really small and probably getting smaller, but people are just jumping on this fad. But I think the good news for PRs is that the really good media story pitches, the really good PRs who can push back against their clients' unrealistic or silly expectations, or really understand or lock into what a journalist wants, or find a new angle on what might seem to be quite a dry story, those PRs really stand out. And I think the traditional PR skills are more in demand than ever. And I think that it's pointless just focusing on how, AI is some kind of panacea for media relations, or storytelling is some kind of panacea. So I think what do journalists want, particularly national media journalists want? Well, I think it's the same as it ever was. It's my advice would be just think like a journalist, write like a journalist, and pitch like a journalist. Although hopefully you'll be better paid than the average journalist. And if you just use again, you probably know this already, but maybe it's just reminding your clients to do this. But also, there's just the simple time-honored two-part test to kind of measure how good a story idea is, or an interview pitch, or a case study pitch is. There's just two questions it must answer, which is, so what and why now? And if you can answer both of those questions, then your story idea, your interview pitch will be much stronger than 95% of the others that, I read in my inbox. And just use things like journalist techniques, like the pyramid method. It's often the sort of inverted pyramid, but I mean, it works just as well with the other way around. The most newsworthy information at the top of the story pitch: who, what, when, where, why, how, if you've got room. Then the important details, and then some more general background information. And I think just using that will sort of be a good quality filter. Let me just talk briefly then about sort of common mistakes I see time and time again when press officers or PR agencies are pitching stories to the media. And I think a lot of these stem from the client of the PR, not the PR. I think that the PR knows that doing these things will reduce the chances that the journalist will use the story or get back to the PR. But, common mistakes: not reading or understanding a journalist's request for comment. So when I'm writing for the Financial Times, and the articles are generally about 800 to 1200 words, analysis, overview, kind of in-depth analysis articles for the general reader, overviews. I'll maybe have space for 5 or 6 people. So experts and case studies are always at a premium, but easily 50%, maybe 75% of PR pitches that are emailed to me after I've put out a request for expert comment, often on LinkedIn. The vast majority of these responses are irrelevant, or the PR has only read half of what I'm after, or they'll just seize on one aspect of the article, a minor one, which is relevant to their client. And it's kind of frustrating because these kind of PRs, I think, are maybe some of the lazier ones. And there's people here who'd be annoyed because it gives PRs a bad name, and there's other agencies with other good clients who could be getting coverage, but they're just being sidelined by sort of bad pitches. And then other common problems I see time and time again: pitching a product, not a story, particularly for tech companies. Not research story. A company's views on
Apologies, you just muted for a little second there. I don't know what happened, but you were on pitching a product, not a story, and then your next point I didn't hear.
Oh, right, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, sort of pitch a product rather than the story. And in general, unless you're sort of, your clients from some really high profile company, OpenAI or whatever, or um, its views on the industry, on the economy, whatever, the broad sweep of things, on what's happening to a really hot technology is of more interest to the journalist than your client's latest widget or software upgrade. And it's, if you've got some interesting customers with new case studies, that's always of more interest to the journalist. But I think this gets lost somehow. And then other common problems, not explaining things clearly. And I seem to spend, like, as a journalist, particularly for the national media, I seem to spend like half of a 30-minute interview just repeating the same things. Well, what do you mean by that? Can you explain that in language your mum would understand? Can you, imagine you're explaining this in language that a 10-year-old would understand? And I have to sort of keep going on and on and on, just because I think a lot of clients, a lot of the executives at a client aren't used to explaining things in really simple language for the general reader. And they're not, sometimes, I don't know, it might be that the PR doesn't push back or insist that they do that, or it's just that they're not, the client isn't listening. So I think that the key thing is, when pitching to the national media, just by getting the basics right, you can really significantly increase the likelihood that you'll get coverage. You'll end up in the national media, either in the print or broadcast media. So, just make it easy for journalists to research, to find your company. And so a lot of like corporate about us sections of company websites make little or no sense. It's like some kind of puzzle. So at the end of it, I'll still have to go off and Google what the company does. Sometimes there's no media page. Companies will have no media page, or if they do, they won't have phone or email contact details for the press office or PR agency, and they'll just have that contact us form, which journalists hate. And there must be dozens or scores of companies who've missed out on me interviewing them for national media articles, just because I've found the company website or someone's mentioned the company. It looks really interesting, but I just can't contact them. And, I'll try and contact people on LinkedIn, executives or marketing people, but sometimes that takes too long, or I don't have time, or I fill in the contact us form and they just come back later. I mean, you'd be surprised, even for high profile newspapers, including one that all businesses want to be in. I remember once I was trying to interview a startup, and this was for a kind of analysis piece. I was looking at some interesting startups, 4 or 5 startups in the article, and I managed to contact the PR for the startup and said, right, explain the article. And it was generally a sort of positive piece, looking like mini profiles of each company, and gave the PR, said, just want to interview your company. It's not going to be a promotional piece, it's going to be journalism, but just looking at how you're growing fast. We've got, about a week or so, which we can do an interview. And the PR press officer just said, well, sorry, we're busy, or we're attending a trade show next week. We just don't have the time to do this, maybe some other time. And I remember thinking, this is, one of the world's leading publications that you could be getting coverage, getting mentioned in this publication would probably boost your profile with investors would help you clarify your messaging, and you can't even be bothered to take 20 minutes to find a 20-minute, half-hour call slot for me to talk to your, chief executive. It's just amazing that people are getting paid to do that kind of media relations. Okay, so what about what do journalists want in a media pitch? Occasionally, I get a really good pitch, and I'll summarize one recently that was by email. Actually, it was a couple of years ago, but I'd say here, one format for a great email story pitch could be the headline, and I'd say make this as precise as possible. So, it might be exclusive news pitch or interview pitch or feature pitch, and then summarize the story in about 3 to 4 words. And then you'd have the first paragraph, the hook of the story, what makes it compelling and newsworthy. Ideally summarize this in a short sentence, so 20 to 30 words maximum. The second paragraph, more information on the main angle of the story. And then the third paragraph is quite important. It's what journalists call the nut paragraph or graph, the nut graph. It's wider significance to an industry, economy, society, the kind of so what factor. Then you've got the fourth paragraph, additional information. Can you provide any proprietary research, new research, interviews with the chief executive, maybe case studies when these people are available? And then the fifth paragraph, just sum up why you think this story idea is right for the newspaper, trade magazine, TV or radio station. And also, ideally, try and write it, study the media title you're pitching to, and just try to write the pitch in the style of the news, in the style of the media organization you're targeting, because that just shows that you're really making an effort, and it will help you stand out from rival pitches. And just send it as bullet points. It doesn't need to be some slick slide deck. Just keep it simple, minimal jargon, and then just try to find, I know this sounds obvious, but try to find the right reporter to send it to. Call a newsroom, ask who, just check if the reporter you're sending it to is actually in, because often you can sort of email it to someone, that reporter might be on holiday, and you'll miss out on potentially a good story. You could email it to someone else. I'll just paraphrase briefly. There was one email pitch I got, is for a Financial Times article I think I was writing, and I don't think I actually ended up using the person, interviewing their company, but it was a really good pitch. And it was basically, I'm paraphrasing because obviously, I don't want to give away the name of the person, but it was, hey, Nick, I spotted your journalist request on X, Twitter. I wanted to see if you'd be interested to speak to so-and-so, so-and-so. Then explains what they do. It was a tech company. And then it was about a cybersecurity story. And then there's just a bit of context about the technology they specialize in, why this person, this executive, was a good person to talk to. They have X number of years of experience in cybersecurity, healthcare, work for some of the top 5 healthcare providers in so-and-so country. And then there was 3 to 5 bullet points of what they can talk about. So in this case, it was certain cybersecurity threats like malware, spyware, what companies must do to minimize these threats. And I just thought that was a really good, succinct, focused story pitch. It was explaining, here's what my client does in plain language. This is what they can talk about. This is why you should consider interviewing them. and, the contact details. Yeah, I think it's also fine to follow up with journalists. PRs will sometimes say to me, well, is it okay to sort of pitch my story by email? And then is it okay to follow up? It's fine to follow up, but as long as the story pitch is relevant. If I think when journalists get a bit irritated, it's when they just get these spray and pray, spammy story pitches, and then it always seems to be those story pitches that get the most insistent and persistent follow-ups from PRs. But it's fine to sort of follow up a few times, and if it's a real time-sensitive story and you're sure that it's of interest to the journalist, then it's fine to maybe call a mobile if the journalist is given a mobile in the sort of media request. AI and news pitches, I just say use with care. As I said before, I use AI in a limited way to record calls, and it takes real-time note. It records my calls in real time and creates a transcript, and that's really useful. But I wouldn't use it for my journalism, for writing. And maybe it's okay in PR's perspective for basic research, generating ideas. But I think a lot more can probably be achieved when you actually meet with your clients, hear what they're doing, have a sort of face-to-face brainstorming session with them. And just be careful, because I think journalists can spot AI written pitches, and it's kind of a bit annoying, and they all come across as a bit generic. You'd just be better off putting in the time and trying to meet more journalists for coffee or even lunch. Although I know it's sometimes hard to do. But that's my little preamble. So maybe if people have got questions, because I don't. Hopefully this can be a bit more of a conversation rather than my sort of monologue and grumbling.
Well, thanks, Nick. That was really, really interesting. Really useful. Guys, if you could pop a question in the chat or raise your hand. Let me see if I can see everybody. I've got a couple of questions in the meantime. The first one is, do journalists still want to meet for coffee, Nick? I know you do, but
yeah, I think they do. I mean, one thing about that is that I know quite a few people on this call are from the Northwest. And I'm now based in Liverpool, but was, in London. I did my time in London for about 14, 15 years. But sometimes I get these coffee chat requests, emails from PRs, and they just assume that I live in London, which is a bit annoying. And I know, everyone's pressed for time, but a bit more research would be welcome. And it's just a very London-centric view of the sort of that comes sometimes of, the media, the PR agency. And yeah, I think it's fine to meet for coffee. I'm probably slightly unusual in that I'm still, produce regular, I'm still a journalist. I'm still really love being a journalist, but now I'm mainly commissioned by the Financial Times. And so I'm not as desperate. It will commission me, and I'm not as desperate for stories. And so I'm more interested in meeting up or having calls with PRs or the tech companies about the other side of my business, sort of content and media consultancy. These kind of coffee chats or lunches with a chief executive from America who's in town, and generally that town is London, they're in for a few days, isn't really a good use of my time, because it could generally be done over a Zoom call. And often those executives or vice presidents don't have anything interesting to say. But I get the sense that they're just, the PRs are under pressure to arrange meetings with journalists.
Okay. We've had a few questions come in. I've got more, but I'm going to move over to Megan, who asked our first question, Megan Clifford. I'm an in-house PR executive, and there's quite a strong expectation to deliver media coverage, but for free. For example, investment in media databases or platforms to reach journalists isn't currently possible. From your experience, how would you approach generating coverage in that situation? Are there effective ways to build relationships with journalists without those tools? Or is it something about pushing back and resetting expectations internally? Is her
Okay,
first one. There's another one, but let's go for that
okay, all
first.
right. Well, that's an interesting question. I'd say you kind of like half answered it, your question with in the latter half of the question. I think you need to perhaps push back a bit to your client, and sometimes it might be that you need to sort of set back more boundaries with your client or create realistic expectations, particularly if it sounds like maybe the client might be a bit penny pinching and pushing back on paying for resources which, although not essential, PR tools you could argue are useful, but there is a lot you can do. Well, first of all, I think it'd be clarify the expectations, media expectations of your client. Is it just national media or trade press? And sometimes when I'm advising peer agencies and the clients behind the scenes, I know almost before I finish answering the question, well, where do you want this, your media coverage, or where do you want this story? They'll always say, oh, well, it's, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes. You think, yeah, I'm sure you'd love that coverage, but it's very unlikely to happen. And first of all, they need to sort of sharpen their messaging and maybe focus first on the trade press. And the trade press isn't a kind of inferior part of the media. It just might be easier to get press coverage when some of your perhaps clients, executives aren't necessarily the sharpest when it comes to media interviews, and when you still need to sort of work out some interesting pitches to pitch to the national media. You can get a lot of great coverage which might be more relevant to your audience in the trade press. But in the sort of the longer term, I think just spend as much time as possible in the research phase and clarify what the basics of your client, what the company does, why it's interesting, what it wants to talk about, and why journalists might be interested in that. And if you think about it like a Venn diagram, there's a small overlap between the two circles of what your client wants to talk about and what journalists are interested in. But you really need to focus on what journalists are interested in, because generally what journalists are interested in is not what your client is interested in. And then it just takes time. Draw up a map, come up with a plan for targeting journalists and target titles, meet them for coffee, arrange Zoom calls. And also, I think more broadly, when I advise companies and the PR agencies on how they want national media coverage, a lot sometimes overlook the broadcast media. For example, if you're in the sort of the Northwest, and your client can get into Salford Media City, the BBC, where they produce quite a lot of TV and radio national media programs. There's things like Wake Up to Money, early morning daily sort of business show. There's a premium if you're a BBC producer, which I've done in the past, in getting guests live on the sofa or in the studio. And a lot of these sort of general business programs, discussion programs, analysis programs, they need experts who can be there in person, who can explain things in simple language, who've got interesting, strong views. So look into those avenues. But that would be my main advice, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. Yes, I think it depends, doesn't it, Megan, what industry you're in, because for some it might be more effective to just go to to go to where your audience is. Megan's also asked, also, is there more opportunity in pitching thought leadership or opinion-based pieces rather than traditional news stories? And how would you go about pitching those kinds of pieces to journalists?
Again, yeah, that's a good point. Opinion articles are a really good way to raise the profile of your client in whatever industry, and get coverage, earned media in the trade press or the national newspapers. Again, national media, it's going to be national newspapers, it's going to be tougher. So I'd say start off with the trade press, where they're probably more open to something that's a bit more technical or specialist in nature. And yeah, come up with, just have a half day session with your client, ideally, rather than just being thrown some breadcrumbs from the table and then I'm expecting to get amazing coverage. Just meet with your client, try and generate 4 or 5 ideas for interesting opinion articles, then start to research possible publications, consider the house style, and contact them to see if they're open to receiving opinion articles, generally opinion articles from, 700 to 1,000 words. But I don't write it and then send it, because you might be wasting your time. Contact the editors first. And if you can't do it in-house, write it in-house, because it's got to be journalistic. Then see if there's a, freelance journalist or someone with a journalism background to help you do that, to help you write it.
Brilliant. Barney Hallowell asks, how hard should we search for a journalist or editor's phone number? Are the ones who appear hard to reach doing that deliberately?
What do you mean they don't want their mobile numbers on the internet so PRs can contact them? I'd say email should be your main source of contact. I mean, I wouldn't want to appear like I'm contradicting myself or hypocritical because I've just said it's really frustrating as a journalist when company press officers or PRs don't have their mobile number or email address available. I think you should have 2, because journalists will often have to contact them at short notice. But yeah, just searches. Again, if you're pitching a really great story, then it's fine. Or if there's something that's really time sensitive and you've been talking with a journalist and the journalist has interviewed your client, and then something has changed in that story, the facts have changed, or a time for interviewing that your client has changed, you really need to contact them urgently, then yeah, call them. Or now what I tend to do when I'm doing stuff for the national media is I'll try and get the mobile of everyone I talk to, just for last minute fact checks, because sometimes for the Financial Times, I'll file my article, it'll be edited, and I might have, if there's queries, I might just have a day or 2 to answer the queries. And so time is of the essence. And so I don't always, sometimes it'll be easier to WhatsApp someone, and I'll only do that if it's urgent. But sometimes that's the best way to get hold of someone.
Yeah. Greg Kopak says, you mentioned that the 2-question test for pitches are so what and why now. It sounds quite simplistic, but how would you react to a pitch that explicitly answers those questions, e.g., so what, X? Why now? Why? I think I know what you mean. You mean actually, Greg, do you mean actually including those words? Is that what you mean?
I do, exactly. Yeah. So pitching something and just writing in there, this is the so what, this is the why not. Sorry, why now? Oh, but why not?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's great. It's fine. I think, I don't think anyone in the media or PR complains about something being too easy to understand. So that's fine. It's just, you're getting to the point, you're being really explicit about why something is a good story, why it's newsworthy. So that's fine. And I think it'll help you stand out from lots of other people, who are pitching. And
I think I would agree with, I've had more success, particularly in broadcast pitches where I've said, why your listeners will love this person, kind of spelt it out. Right, Severa, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. We've seen changes across Reach PLC regarding calling experts quoted in commentary to check that they are not fake AI experts. What has been your experience with this, and have you seen similar across wider media where you're not interviewing experts?
Yeah, that's another good point. And I think Press Gazette have done some, some really interesting stories and investigative work about this problem, which is becoming a growing problem. It actually almost happened to me once when it was maybe a couple of years ago, when I was writing a story. I think it was for the Financial Times, and I was looking for a case study. And as ever, with the kind of stories I do, it's often the case study, finding a good case study, which is, relatable, is one of the hardest things. And I found what I thought was a good case study and contacted the PR agency. And there was just something about the way it was written and the way the person was referred to, and it was like a US style job title when it was a sort of UK business. I thought, that's a bit weird. And then I contacted the PR agency. Can I talk to this person? And it would have been an ideal case study. And then the more research I did, the more slightly mysterious it got. It's like the case of the disappearing case study. It was sort of, this person, who was a young person, it was like an apprentice style sort of role. And then this person went on to go and work in a more senior level in, I think it was cybersecurity. But they had absolutely I couldn't find any imprint of them on social media, including LinkedIn. And obviously it's not compulsory that, someone has a LinkedIn account or profile, but I just thought it was weird. I just couldn't find anything about them. I got the PR agency wasn't very responsive. I even called this company, this business, which this supposed mysterious person worked at. It's like a deadline, or I couldn't get through. And in the end, I sort of didn't run the case study, and ran the story with a different case study, followed up and made a kind of semi-formal complaint to the PR agency, because I basically said, I think the company has just created this fictitious person and it's misleading, and why is it still, I checked, it was still a case study on the client's website. And I said, I think unless you haven't been able to verify it, are you going to take it down? And they did, although they claimed that nothing was untoward. But generally, that's why now, as long as I've got enough time, then I'd rather sort of talk to someone, ideally not even just a phone call, on a Zoom call. But then it's kind of scary, because there's a lot of trust implicit between, when it comes to case studies, and between journalists, press officers, and PR agencies. And there was the assumption that this will be above board and it will have been verified and stuff. But yeah, I'm certainly a bit more skeptical or cautious.
Yeah, you could still get catfished by a fake Zoom person, Nick. I mean,
yeah, that's true.
It's scary when you think about it. Megan came back to say we're in tech and SaaS. So I would say that starting with trade, which often has much smaller pool of journalists and editors, would be appropriate for tech. and SAS particularly, would you?
Yeah, definitely. And as long as it's not, they often trade press often like need a steady stream of opinion articles, but as long as it's not a disguised sales plug, which is just really cringeworthy, then as long as you've got a strong argument, something new and interesting to say back, and you can back up your arguments with some evidence.
I know I know this is actually about your expertise, Nick, not mine, but something that I've learned, Megan, that might be helpful is, if you can meet them. And if you go to a trade show, back in the day anyway, trade shows always used to have a press stand or a press area. You can grab one or two journalists, have a coffee and find out what they want to cover. What stories are they interested in? If you can get time with a journalist, that's always a good idea, so that what you're sending to them. Nick, back to something that you said. You mentioned, that it doesn't go down well when PRs use AI for pitches. Other than them being very generic, as you said, are there any obvious tells to you if somebody's used AI?
Yeah, sometimes the kind of tell is that it's like suspiciously it flows a bit too well, and it's kind of like seamless, and it's slightly annoyingly upbeat. And it just doesn't ring true. And I don't care if there's is M dashes or N dashes, so always get mixed up. Because I use those loads and always have done well before AI in my journalism and then thought leadership stuff. I ghostwrite. It just doesn't quite ring true, and then it's probably no surprise because a lot of the AI suggestions is just going to be a rehash of what's already been said. And I think the best media pitches and story pitches are the ones which are really thoroughly researched and, like good journalism, make connections between things which you hadn't really associated before and find new angles on old subjects.
Love that. I wondered if it was worth very quick. We've got 5 minutes left, so if anybody has any other questions, please do drop them into the chat. Oh, you did touch on, Nick, you are a freelancer now. I wonder if it might be worth just explaining very quickly the difference between a freelancer and a staffer for PRs who are targeting one or both.
Sure. As a freelancer, I think freelancers probably less interested in story ideas from PRs unless they're great exclusive ideas, because as a freelancer, and when I've done investigative journalism in my time, I'd only pitch an exclusive or off diary story to, say, the national media if it's a great, really strong story which I know they haven't got themselves or would struggle to get themselves because I've got access to insider information or the right experts. And so it's pointless sending, including freelancers generally, in sort of generic press releases or story pitches that you're also sending at the same time to a newspaper.
Okay. I have, if there's no other questions, if everybody could join me in a metaphorical hand clap for Nick for his wisdom today. There's some really good nuggets in there. Megan saying thank you so much for your insights and help. Nice heart there from Greg, clapping from Severa and Barney. Abby, thanks everybody for joining. Nick, my last question is, how do the two lucky agencies, how are we going to do that? Do I send you the attendees afterwards and you metaphorically pick them out a hat, or?
Yeah, I'm wondering, there'll probably be some like software which can do this, but yeah, if we just work out a way to totally at random pick two agencies, and then it will be just in the next month or so arrange a 30-minute call with me in which you can sort of pick my brain on ideally one burning media relations problem or opportunity, or content problem or opportunity. And yeah, we'll just talk it through for half an hour, and I'll just give you my opinion and any, recommendations.
Thank you. Well, brilliant. You and I will do that. I'll find some way of doing it so that it's fair. Thank you, everybody. There's lots of nice comments and thanks on the chat. Thank you so much for being here and giving your time. Hopefully you all know me if you're Northwest based, and if you're not, please feel free to link in with me and say hello. And this session, I will make it available to everybody when there's sometimes a bit of a queue, a 2 to 3 week queue, but it will be online and available to watch. The last one that I hosted about PR interviews for podcast PR is now live. So if anybody has any problems or wants to ask any questions, please drop me a note. I'm sure, Nick, you'll be happy for people to contact you directly too. Do you want to add your LinkedIn to the chat?
Yeah, sure. I'd say as ever, probably trying to have my cake and eat it. I'm less interested in the story pitches, more interested in if you want some potential support for your agency or client for media relations or content strategy. Yeah, I've
just done it for you, Nick.
Oh, great. Yeah.
That was fair while you were talking. Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks everybody. And until the next one, thanks again, Nick. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.